Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is May 24th, 2011, and my guest is Barry Eichengreen, the George C. Pardee and Helen N. Pardee Professor of Economics and Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of Exorbitant Privilege, The Rise and Fall of the Dollar, and the Future of the International Monetary System. Barry, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ. Good to be here.
Your book is a brisk history of international finance, focusing on how the U.S. dollar became the dominant currency in the world, and the possibility that that dominance might come to an end sometime in the future. Let's start with why it matters. Why is it important that the dollar is the dominant currency? Why is that important to the United States?
Well, the fact that the dollar is the dominant currency is of considerable convenience to U.S. banks and firms. When they do business with foreign banks and firms, they can do it in their own currency without having to incur the cost of buying euros or Swiss francs or British pounds, and they don't have to insure against the risk that the exchange rate will change while that business is underway. Other countries look at us, the Chinese look at us, and they see that it's an advantage for American banks and firms to be able to do business globally in dollars, and that's part of the motivation now for the Chinese to begin to move cautiously to internationalize their currency as well.
Now, that's not the only convenience is not the only important privilege that having the dollar be dominant gives us. And when we say dominant, we're talking about the fact that dollars are accepted in most international transactions. The price of oil is denominated in dollars. What are some of the other privileges that the U.S. accrues for its the importance of the dollar?
The fact that the dollar is viewed as the ultimate form of liquidity, that the U.S. Treasury bond market is the single most liquid financial market in the world, makes it attractive to international investors, banks in other countries, and notably foreign central banks and governments to hold dollars as a form of insurance against the possibility that something might go wrong in global financial markets. There's the possibility that food prices might go up, requiring countries that import food or energy, to take another timely example. They may need additional dollars to finance their imports. So as the global economy grows, foreign governments and central banks want to acquire more of this insurance. That allows the United States, in effect, to export green pieces of paper, which cost us very little to produce, and import Toyotas and BMWs and the like. Economists refer to this as seigniorage, the ability of the United States to provide the global currency at low cost to ourselves. And I suggest in the book, I estimate in the book, that U.S. living standards are about 3% higher in total than they would be otherwise as a result of this exorbitant privilege that at the moment only the United States possesses.
Now, the dominance of the U.S. Treasury market, that allows the United States government to borrow money at slightly lower rates than it otherwise would, correct?
Correct. So one reason that U.S. living standards are higher than they would be in the absence of the fact that the dollar is not only our currency, but the world's. One form in which that benefit accrues to us is indeed that The U.S. government can borrow money for less. Treasury bond prices are higher and yields are lower than they would be otherwise because the People's Bank of China and the Brazilian Central Bank and others have been buying dollars big time.
Why are they doing that?
Well, they're doing it for a couple of reasons. I alluded to one, which is that they value the liquidity of the dollar, and they see dollar balances, dollar reserves, as a form of insurance. But they're also buying dollars to keep their own currencies down, to keep their own exports competitive. For the last 30 years, China has been pursuing a very successful development model that has centered, as every American now knows, on exports. And to keep their exports competitive, they've been keeping their currency low. The other way of viewing that is they have an interest in keeping the dollar high, and they've been buying U.S. Treasury bonds. And before the crisis, not incidentally, the securities of Freddie and Fannie, the government-sponsored mortgage agencies, partly to achieve that, to keep their currencies down, their exports to the United States competitive. So economists argue about, as they do about many things, they argue about the relative importance of these two motives. Some countries are interested in obtaining dollars as insurance. Others kind of accumulate them inadvertently as a byproduct of their strategies of export-led growth.
We're going to digress for a minute here because I think this is so important, and the mechanics of this will be useful, I hope, as we continue talking. This argument that China is trying to manipulate the price of its exports to the rest of the world through its behavior with the dollar. Walk me through that and how that interacts with the, say, government-sponsored agencies. So if I look at China, I see them taking dollars that they've earned from exports and using them to buy government-sponsored agency Fannie and Freddie bonds, which were attracted to them because they had a slightly higher yield, but they viewed them correctly, as it turned out, as being just as safe as U.S. Treasuries. How does that affect their currency? What does that have to do with it?
Well, there are a couple of different respects in which these transactions matter. So one of them is that, as we were talking about before, China is trying to make its exports to the United States as competitive as possible. For a long time, China has had virtually unlimited supplies of labor to the modern manufacturing sector. I think that era may now be drawing to a close, but that's a different story. So wages in China have been stable, and the way they have been able to keep their exports competitive is by keeping their currency stable and thereby keeping their labor costs, their wages in terms of dollars stable. And they do that by preventing their currency from rising against the dollar. They buy the dollar if it shows a tendency to fall against the Chinese renminbi, and they end up, therefore, holding trillions of dollars in U.S. Treasury bonds. So that's how it matters for them, and the irony of that process is something that has benefited them greatly for the last 20 years. Export-led growth has been an astounding success for China. May now be coming back to haunt them because if the dollar begins to decline against China's currency, as seems likely going forward, they're going to take losses on their holdings of U.S. Treasuries. The other respect in which it matters, I think, has been in terms of pouring more fuel on the fires that led to the financial crisis in the United States. So the financial crisis had multiple causes. No event as serious as the financial crisis of 2007, 2009 could result from only one factor. But among those causes, I think, were the low interest rates on relatively safe securities like U.S. Treasury bonds that led other investors, banks, and investment funds in the United States to stretch for yield, to look for yield in other financial markets like the subprime market, the subprime securitization market, and all that.
I find that claim a bit mystifying, but I found your earlier claim equally so, and I want to get back to that. Maybe we'll get to the crisis later. This idea that, and I'm going to use a phrase, tell me if I'm using it correctly, because I always find this equally perplexing. China, in your story about their export-led growth, wants a strong dollar, which means relative to other currencies. They want a weak Chinese currency in order that Chinese goods should be cheap. And is that a correct summary of what you said?
So far, so good.
Okay. So that's good for the United States, it seems, on average. It's not good for every person in the United States. But you're suggesting that despite their extraordinarily low labor costs, which would certainly be part of the reason that their exports are so attractive, despite that, they have decided to encourage an even further cheapening of the price of their goods to American consumers, thereby giving us a windfall. Is that correct or not correct?
Yeah, that's basically correct. So,
why do they do that?
Well, look at the Chinese economy. Household consumption is only 1/3 of Chinese national income. Barely half what you would see in an advanced economy.
Right, it's about 2/3.
Essentially, they're interested in foregoing current consumption, current gratification, in order to generate faster growth and higher living standards in the future. So Chinese leadership is engaged in this calculated strategy where they think there is a lot of learning by doing and learning by exporting in particular, by building a assembly platform not only for their producers, but for our producers, for foreign multinationals.
Sure.
They will acquire foreign technology and know-how, and by sacrificing gratification now, they'll have faster growth and higher living standards in the future.
Could be.
And conversely, if Americans get to live beyond their means for a period, we were running current account deficits, essentially trade deficits of 6% of GDP before the crisis, consuming 6% more than we produced as a nation. That was something that the Chinese were willing to finance for a time as the price to be paid for 10% growth.
Now, there are some people, you use language is, of course, very difficult to use precisely, especially in economics. That's why we have all our jargon. But what you said is, the first part is very straightforward. When we import more than we export by 6%, our trade deficit, that allows us to consume more than we produce. Now, a household can do that by borrowing. But as you point out in the book, a nation can do that without borrowing if it provides something of value that makes the currency flows attractive to finance that current account or trade deficit. And I use the word finance. That's one of those words. It's a little bit hard to know exactly what that means. but I'm being a little bit of a stickler here on behalf of my colleague, Don Boudreau, who always likes to point out that when you run a trade deficit, it does not mean you're going into debt. And as you point out in the book, if the Chinese are willing to hold U.S. dollars for whatever reason, whether it's this currency issue or insurance, whatever it is, if the U.S. is an attractive place to invest, we can live beyond our means in a way without going into debt. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I should, in the interest of fairness, acknowledge that there's a second explanation for why the U.S. has been running these persistent external deficits, and countries like China have been running persistent external surpluses. That second explanation saying there is a shortage of safe liquid assets in the world, and only the United States is really in a position to supply them. So I think historically that explanation has a lot of merit to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But going forward, a lot of people are worried about whether these U.S. dollar assets are really safe, and what has worked in the past will work in the future.
There's two aspects of safe, one of which I think everybody understands. The second, you don't talk about much in your book, and I was surprised. One definition of safe is that the country honors its promises. The country doesn't default. There isn't a revolution, so that you can't get into the bank where your stuff is. That's one measure of safe. The other measure of safe is stable, meaning that the purchasing power of the asset is relatively stable. And inflation, more accurately relative inflation rates, would seem to be extremely important. Are they empirically? In other words, the U.S. historically has run relatively low inflation relative to other nations, but they're not the only country that has relatively low inflation. And it's interesting to me that other countries are not more successful in being a source of foreign funds for that reason.
Yeah, so I think price stability is important, and I think I would politely disagree with your characterization before that I don't talk very much about stability in the book.
Price stability, inflation.
Yeah, I do think that the price stability is important if a country is going to retain its status as the issuer of a global currency. And liquidity is important as well, that the asset, you have to be able to convert it into something else you want, energy or food or some other essential import, without driving down the price of that asset when you sell it off. So the U.S. has the advantage of liquid financial markets, and it has done well over the last 50 years in terms of, relatively speaking, in terms of maintaining price stability. So I do think both aspects matter. I would finally observe that we had a period of bad performance in terms of inflation in the 1970s. And Absolutely. There were a lot of predictions at that point about migration away from the dollar towards some alternative unit like the Japanese yen or the German Deutschmark.
There was no euro at the time.
So it didn't happen. I do think inflation poses a risk to currency stability, but you've got to do a really bad job for an extended period before a currency like the dollar loses the advantages of incumbency.
Well, one phrase you hear sometimes is the dollar retains its attractiveness because it's the tallest pygmy. So even though the dollar's not doing very well, everybody else is doing worse. So you're just, that is what matters. It's your relative performance. And certainly in the 70s, the U.S. wasn't the only country experiencing inflation, and that may have been part of the reason it was able to survive it. It certainly helped, right?
The other way to people put it is the least ugly contestant at the beauty pageant, and that continues to support the dollar's global role today, that the alternatives all have problems of their own.
Let's talk about monetary policy. And you have a lot of of very interesting historical episodes where central banks, either American or non-American, struggled to deal with the fact that they had one goal domestically with monetary policy that conflicted with an international goal. And I think the subtlety of that dilemma escapes many of us. Can you give us some examples of that, or even just speak generally about the advantage the U.S. has over other central banks, given that the dollar is the international currency, and that other central banks struggle because of that in this dilemma?
Well, the problem that other central banks face is that there are all kinds of firms and banks and households in their countries who have debts in other currencies, in other people's money. So in the country of Hungary, for example, most of the car loans are not in Hungarian forints, but they're in Swiss francs, because Swiss banks have lent money to Hungarian banks in Swiss francs, and the Hungarian banks turn around and lend the money, make the car loan to car purchasers in Budapest in Swiss francs. So if the Hungarian forint depreciates, it loses value against the Swiss franc. Suddenly the Hungarian worker, the Hungarian household that has bought a car, finds that its wages in forint won't pay for the car loan anymore. The Hungarian central bank, therefore, cannot let the currency fall too much against the Swiss franc. It may want an accommodating monetary policy, a low interest rate policy to support the economy, but if it sees the forint falling against the Swiss franc, it's going to have to tighten up, regardless of the other consequences. The United States doesn't have to worry about that. At his famous press conference last month, Mr. Bernanke said, like,
famous because of its uniqueness.
Yeah, said, we believe in a strong dollar, but the U.S. can follow what's called a policy of benign neglect toward the exchange rate of the dollar, and basically worry entirely about what policies are appropriate for the U.S. economy. With
the only risk that it could kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. It could take, if it abuses that exorbitant privilege too excessively, it will call into question the value of the currency as a international exchange mechanism. And so there's potentially costs, but they're nothing like what other nations have to deal with.
Exactly.
Are you familiar with Doug Irwin's argument about the role that gold flows in the run-up to the Great Depression played in France, that France was hoarding currency, forcing the U.S. And other nations to absorb deflation?
Yeah, I'm familiar with the argument, and I've written along similar lines in my earlier book, Golden Fetters. There are those parallels between what France did then in the run-up to the Great Depression and what China has been doing recently.
Yeah, why is that? But I interviewed Doug, and we had an interesting conversation about his work, and the question of whether it's explain how China, through its policy, and I'm a skeptic on this, so because I think it's hard to know, but you're making the claim that they're following this deliberate policy. How would that hurt us? How could they cause us, say, deflation or some other monetary impact that we would be unable to offset?
Well, the problem at the moment, and there are other folks like Paul Krugman who are more articulate exponents of this particular story than I am, is that the U.S. would like to offset the deflationary impact of low prices caused in part by cheap goods coming into China but we have a variety of constraints now that prevent us in the United States from doing anything about that. One is that it's hard to use monetary policy any more extensively than we've used it. The Fed is up against what is called the zero bound.
Right.
And fiscal policy is not available either for economic reasons, if you're worried about the medium-term debt dynamics in the United States, or for political reasons.
Yeah. I don't understand that argument. Let me try to explain my confusion, and I actually think I suspect you're as articulate as Mr. Krugman. Maybe just you're a little quieter. He does yell about it. He's worked up over it, and I don't understand it, because if China, let's say, we could think of three ways that China could deliver us cheap manufactured goods. One is, well, more than three, but I'll just pick a few. They could artificially subsidize them directly through domestic tax subsidy policies. They could do it through the currency, as you're suggesting that they do. It could happen because they have a very low labor costs, or that those costs are falling. Or they could just be very productive. In fact, they could be increasingly productive. So they continue to deliver us inexpensive goods. All of those things would be good for us, and they wouldn't be deflationary. They'd be deflationary in manufactured goods, but in the absence of overall monetary policy being different, other prices would rise, and the price level would respond. The price level as a whole wouldn't be deflationary nor inflationary in those different scenarios. What am I missing?
Well, you're missing the importance of aggregate demand. That much of, I think, what you were describing before, Russ, is about the supply of Chinese goods and the benefits to American consumers of the fact that flat-screen TVs are cheaper at Best Buy than they would be if China was not following its current policies. But the argument goes, and at the moment I think it has merit, that we also have a problem of aggregate demand. There has to be a demand for American goods in order to get employment growth going. We have a serious unemployment problem in the United States that we will only get traction on if we get the economy to grow faster. We can't stimulate domestic demand using the normal policy instruments because we've fired those bullets and we're out of them. And so the argument goes China is artificially diverting the fixed lump of demand that we have in the United States at the moment, partly toward its own cheap exports, and that's leaving less work for Americans.
But that doesn't happen.
I agree. There are other ways of solving that problem over time. American workers need to become more productive. We need more capital formation. We need to invest in skills and training, and we can solve that problem. But right now, 9% unemployment is a problem, and I think Chinese policy contributes to that. I'm not saying that China is responsible for our 9% unemployment, but its policies are not helping.
Okay, so I'm not a Keynesian, which is neither here nor there. I don't want to get into the intricacies of aggregate demand management. But if I think about this as maybe it's thinking about it in a different context and not in a crisis time. If another nation makes stuff better than we do through what we usually call either creative destruction or comparative advantage, we go on to make something else, and it's easier to do because we don't have to devote as many resources as we used to make flat-screen TVs. So, in particular, it's I don't want American workers to get more competitive at making flat-screen TVs. Let's let the Chinese make them. Why would we want to do that? Right.
So you put your finger on it. In a crisis time, in a period when there is inadequate aggregate demand, the effects of foreign policies on the United States are different than in normal times. In a fully employed economy or something close to that, your argument about how the Chinese have a comparative advantage in assembling consumer electronics, so Americans ought to move into other activities, and everybody is better off, is exactly right. But we're not in that full employment world at the moment, so I'm going to avoid labels entirely. But I would ask you whether an economy with 9% unemployment is whether we can really apply your story about comparative advantage is all that matters and aggregate demand doesn't, to an economy with 9% unemployment where we don't have tools at home to stimulate demand at the moment.
Well, I guess the disagreement there would be that the tools that we have, we don't agree on whether they work or not, whether the past stimulus package, whether that helped, whether it did nothing, whether it was inadequate, not big enough. But let me just make an historical remark, which you bring up in your historical section of the book, which is that Keynes, who was a classical liberal in many dimensions before the Great Depression, did find himself advocating protectionism at various times to the surprise and disappointment of some of his colleagues, but it's exactly for the reason that you're talking about. He was he felt that foreign exports were taking up jobs, which he would not have said in healthy times, I think. He was a free trader historically. Yeah,
so he had been a dedicated free trader. He found himself in 1931 in a situation where unemployment in Britain was approaching 20%, where for a combination of reasons the government didn't have other tools with which to address it, and he reluctantly concluded that a tariff to bottle up the fixed lump of demand that Britain had at home was the best of a variety of bad choices. What happened next, of course, was that Britain went off the gold standard and monetary policy became available to the Bank of England, and Keynes changed his mind yet again. You know, his famous phrase was, when the circumstances change, I change my mind. Young man, what do you do?
Right.
So he said a tariff really is no longer appropriate now that we have monetary policy again.
Let's go back to the history. Let's go back to U.S. history. You tell a very interesting story of the evolution of just the dollar from the very beginning. But you go back to colonial times. And by the way, to the listeners out there, this is a short. I said brisk at the beginning, and that I meant short. It's I think it's 177 pages. Is that? I read it on my Kindle, so I don't have the page numbers exactly, but it's not long. So when we talk about these historical episodes, Barry, you do a very nice job in talking about them in short but very illuminating strokes. So you go back to colonial times, and the U.S. doesn't even have a currency to start with. It only has British pounds because it's a British colony. And in its early days, it struggles to create any traction for the dollar at all in any international sense. And somehow it manages, as if that's a meaningful phrase, historical events occur by which the dollar overtakes the pound sterling. Try to give us a thumbnail sketch of how that very unpredictable event took place.
Well, it took place through a combination of conscious policy initiative by U.S. politicians and officials on the one hand, and historical circumstance on the other. There was a big financial crisis in the United States in 1907 that was managed by J.P. Morgan and his right-hand man, Benjamin Strong, a New York banker, in the absence of a central bank. The lesson drawn from that was that the United States should have a central bank, and that led to the Federal Reserve Act and the founding of the Fed in 1914. But the other thing that was going on at the same time...
1913, I think, right? 1913?
I think the act in 1913 and the opening in 1914.
Right.
As you said, the history is brisk.
Yeah, I love that kind of precision. Thank you. Go ahead.
But the other thing that the founders were concerned about was this fact that the dollar played no international role, that U.S. importers and exporters, when they needed trade credit, had to go to London in order to get it from an English bank, that they bore the additional transactions costs of having to buy a foreign currency. If a U.S. importer of coffee beans from Brazil wanted to pay his Brazilian counterparty, he had to ask his local bank for a letter of credit. The local bank had to ask a correspondent bank in London for the letter. Everything was denominated in pound sterling, and that was a considerable disadvantage for U.S. merchants and traders and producers.
One of the things you highlight is the challenge of buying stuff from other countries, which we take totally for granted in today's world. But for much of the early part of the U.S. history, as you point out, you had to pay this guy in Brazil something he could use, and he didn't want dollars usually.
And almost without exception, they didn't want dollars. They didn't know about dollars. They didn't regard dollars as convenient. London was the global financial center. It was in 1914 what New York is today. Everybody kept their deposits in London. Everybody got their trade finance, their credit in London, and all of that was denominated in sterling. So the founders of the Fed basically set out to change that by creating a central bank that could provide liquidity to U.S. financial markets. The instrument that they created was called the trade acceptance, which was basically a security that was used to finance trade. And the Fed began to buy and sell those trade acceptances big time.
Well, the whole, I wanted to stop you earlier, but the word credit, we think of, I think the average American thinks of credit as what you need if you can't afford something right now. But if you're a commercial producer, credit is, you got to have credit because you don't have, the timing is always a little bit different. Just to be a going concern, you have to be able to get access to money before the money comes in to pay it off.
So the American importer of coffee beans from Brazil is going to import the bags full of beans, and he's got to pay for that now. He will roast the beans, he will sell them, and he will get the income from the transaction down the road. He needs a credit in the meantime. Yeah,
no, it's an extraordinary thing that we don't ever think about, and the idea of doing that internationally. That in the absence of the central bank, in the absence of this asset you're talking about, you a few minutes ago described the process. You'd have to get a letter of credit. You'd get your local bank to get a letter of credit from an English bank. Wasn't that timing extraordinarily costly, or did it sort of come to be somewhat smoother as people trusted reliable merchants and banks?
It was expensive by our modern standards when we're used to only paying a couple of dollars when we stick a bank card into a machine in a foreign airport. But it became more efficient with the passage of time. So the City of London, the name for London's financial center, really came to specialize over the course of the 19th century in providing this credit. The banks in London were referred to as merchant banks. We would call them investment banks using 21st century lingo. But they were merchant banks because they specialized in providing credit for merchants who were doing import and export trade, and they got pretty good at it.
So the Federal Reserve comes along, it starts creating a market in these basically what are import-export credits that'll make it a little bit easier for American firms to operate abroad. How do you get from there to dominating the pound sterling?
Well, you get there because this market grows very quickly, and there's another big event, World War I, that intervenes and kind of cuts the City of London off from a lot of its customary business. The two things combine. By 1924, the dollar has moved from a point where 10 years earlier it was not used internationally at all to where now it's used in 1924 to finance more foreign trade as the currency in which more international bonds are issued, and it becomes more important. It's already more important as a reserve currency than the pound sterling. So that's a very rapid changing of the guard, and it reflected two things: the creation of the Fed and the Fed's campaign to create these markets and internationalize the dollar, plus the disruptions of World War I.
But the third factor, and this is, of course, all these factors, what's interesting about the story and the way you structure the book is that if it's possible for an upstart currency to overcome some of the advantages of an incumbent currency, you start to wonder whether it could happen again. And we'll come back to that and talk about China or maybe the euro as well. But the other factor, I assume, and if I remember you talk about it in the book, is just the absolute growth in the U.S. economy as a market for economic activity generally. That's relevant as well, correct?
It is. So if you ask me what are the preconditions for your currency to be the dominant global unit, I would answer three things. Number one, a big platform that you do a lot of international trade and investment, what you just said. Number two, stability, low inflation and all that. And number three, that your financial markets are liquid and viewed with confidence.
So let's turn to China. They're pretty good on the first one. They're enormously growing, at least for now. Some say that it may not last, but they're growing like leaps by leaps and bounds. So they're a big platform. What was the second?
The second one is price stability. Price
stability, hard to know. They're a little bit opaque, which would be one challenge that they will have, obviously. We have our opaqueness as well in the United States, unfortunately, but we're, again, by the tallest pygmy, we're pretty opaque. We're pretty transparent relative to China, data-wise and price-wise, et cetera, right? And the third would be liquidity. And as you point out in the book, China has been very uneasy about opening its foreign currency to easy, liquid international transactions. Talk about that.
Yeah. So I think you put it well. And the Chinese understand these different dimensions of global currency status. International currency status has different aspects to it. Your currency can be used as a means of payment and a unit of account for imports and exports. And they're now moving very rapidly to encourage their companies and foreign companies to do cross-border trade using their means of payment and unit of account, the renminbi. 2 years ago, 0 Chinese companies used their own currency in import and export trade. Now something on the order of 70,000 do so. So they're moving pretty fast. The second thing they have to do is enhance the liquidity of their financial markets and open them to foreign investors. That's going to be harder. It will create risks to their economy if they go too fast, and creating confidence on the part of foreign investors so that foreign private investors and central banks are willing to park their money in Shanghai is going to be harder. But they are moving in that direction as well. So they've authorized, they've allowed a bunch of companies to issue Chinese renminbi denominated bonds, dim sum bonds they're called, in Hong Kong. McDonald's has done it, Caterpillar has done it, and they use the revenues to invest in operations in China. They've authorized a number of banks in Hong Kong to invest in the interbank market in mainland China as well. So they are gradually letting foreign investors in to a limited extent, completing that process and really creating, turning Shanghai into an international financial center. Their stated goal by 2020 is going to be a lot harder.
What's their stated goal by 2020?
Well, they've said Shanghai should be a true international financial center to rival London and New York by 2020. That's gonna be hard to accomplish, but I'd also observe that we've repeatedly underestimated how fast the Chinese can move before. They may well achieve that.
So let's talk about what the U.S. Could do in the negative sense, what mistakes the United States might make or choices that might be forced on us that would make that transition easier for the Chinese. One thing that many people are worried about, and I'm agnostic about it, slightly worried, is the magnitude of the reserves that U.S. banks hold on the Fed's balance sheet and the potential for those reserves to come out when things get a little bit better and be inflationary, which I assume, which would, for example, not literally lead to a default, but would lower the value of what we repay foreigners for debts that we've incurred, treasuries and those other assets we were talking about earlier, agency securities. What are your thoughts on that? And is that the right thing to worry about? Are there other things to worry about if I'm worried about that 3% bonus that we're getting from the dollar?
I think, as I say in the book, the Chinese are not going to cause a dollar crash. If there is one, we will do it. We Americans will do it to ourselves. But I would really, myself, draw a very strong distinction between the monetary risks and the budgetary risks. I think I would disagree with you, Russ, about the danger posed by Fed policy. The Fed has been thinking long and hard about its exit strategy, how to shrink its balance sheet, how to prevent that liquidity from doing what the Mississippi River is doing, near Baton Rouge. I think they will be able to reverse out those liquidity injections and shrink their balance sheet when the time comes. The danger to the dollar, it comes from medium-term fiscal policy. I think if foreigners can conclude that responsible adults are not making fiscal policy in the United States, and if the winner of the 2012 presidential election doesn't use his honeymoon to push through a credible medium-term fiscal plan, then foreigners could decide there are risks of some kind of open or covert debt default in the United States. The pressure to inflate away the spiraling U.S. debt will become irresistible. They'll dump their treasury securities, and at some point the dollar will crash. That, to my mind, is the worry. So I wrote in the book about how we have maybe 5 years in the U.S. to get our fiscal house in order. I've grown more pessimistic. I think 2013 will be roughly the last chance from this point of view.
Yeah, there's not a lot of encouraging signs on the political horizon that people are making. There's not a lot of encouraging signs that responsible adults are are acting accordingly. So it is a little bit of a scary. It is a scary time. My monetary worries come from an observation that Alan Meltzer made on this program that while the Fed understands how to reverse that flow of funds, it will not have the political will to do so. That as the economy is starting to recover and unemployment is starting to finally come down, it'll be very difficult for the Fed to follow a tight money policy. That's the issue.
Yeah, and I see the merit to that argument. If the economy is weak, sharply lower asset prices, which would be the implication of the Fed selling off a lot of what it's bought, would not have happy effects.
Well, we have a few minutes left. Let's close. Let's talk a little bit about the crisis and maybe some of the international aspects to it. You give a very nice survey of the different contributing factors. You leave out a factor I'll come back to, but you do at the end suggest that a lot of these factors, overconfidence in risky assets and the techniques to assess risk, like value at risk that we've talked a lot on this program about, the originate and distribute model, the idea that mortgage originators were not holding the paper that they originated and therefore were not as careful, the role of ratings agencies, the search for yield that you talked about. But at the end you say, but a lot of this would maybe be not so important if monetary policy had not been so accommodating. I really want to just ask you a technical question about monetary policy. And again, longtime listeners will understand my relentless confusion and curiosity about this. You, as many do, including John Taylor, who's talked about it on the program, focus on interest rate changes and the channel by which interest rates affect asset prices, send signals about costs, et cetera. But in the old days, we focused on the money supply, the liquidity that was out there that financed much of this activity. Do you, when we talk about Greenspan in the 2003 to 2005 period, 2002 to 2004, where he is just before that lowered interest rates dramatically and then suddenly increases them, what does that have to do with the supply of money? Anything, in your way of organizing your thinking, the lens you use to look at the world, do you think about both? Do you think about just interest rates? How do you think about that?
I think about both. So I'm a student of Jim Tobin at Yale, and Tobin believed that money and bonds and stocks and other securities are all imperfect substitutes for one another. Changes in the price of one will kind of cascade over into changes in prices of the others, and you've got to worry about the whole collection. So I don't think there is a magic monetary single magic monetary variable, either a price or a quantity, that will tell you whether monetary policy is too tight or too loose. So John Taylor would look at one policy rate and he would compare it to the rate spit out by his particular model of optimal Fed policy rates. I think kind of the whole vector, the whole range of interest rates matters, and you've got to look at quantities as well as prices. So I'm sorry about giving you a woolly answer to a very precise question, but I'm not of the view that there is either one magic monetary aggregate or one magic interest rate that will tell you whether monetary policy is too hot, too cold, or just right.
No, I'm a woolly guy myself. I just think it's interesting how we look at one or the other sometimes when we're telling stories, and I don't see a lot of people looking at the supply of money when they're looking in the last 3 or 4 years or longer, going back the last decade. Most people just look at the price. They just look at the discount rate, and they don't look at the implications of quantities. So when I look at Bernanke again and talking about the current situation we're in, I see this weird world where he's paying unprecedented. He's paying interest for banks to hold their money with him, and which I view as just a backdoor subsidy to the balance sheets of banks to prevent a catastrophe or to help them if you have a sinister view of the world. And very untraditional monetary policy, but that if it were left alone and those reserves do go out, it's a quantity issue I'm going to be worrying about, not a price issue. So that's what I think about it. Maybe it's, and I find it somewhat confusing, to be honest.
Well, I can certainly agree with the confusing part. We talk a lot in terms of the prices of the interest rates because that's what the talking heads on CNN and the market participants talk about. So maybe academics like you and me ought to try to compensate for that by talking a little bit more about the quantities. I'm just back from Brazil, where they talk about the quantities all the time. They're experiencing big capital inflows that are fueling rapid growth of bank lending, and they're worried about the consequences. That's why they've slapped on some controversial capital controls. But in other parts of the world, the quantities are pretty prominent.
Well, when I interviewed Milton Friedman back in 2006, I asked him this question, and he said, well, the Fed likes to talk about interest rate policy, but all they really do is they're really paying attention to M2. That's something we don't even talk about anymore. We don't even keep track. Do we keep track of M2?
I think we do. Go look.
One of them got cut recently. They don't even keep track of it anymore.
Yeah. Well, what we have discovered, in my view, is that the relationship between the different M's and the real economy, economic activity, has been shifting around because we've had a lot of financial innovation in recent decades. That means that M2 is not always a reliable compass for what monetary policy is going to do to the real economy.
Yeah, of course, neither is discount rate exactly, but it's
a
complicated
it means,
world.
As you say, the discount rate may not be a reliable compass either by itself.
I just want to close with a challenge on something that you talk about in the book about the crisis, and as I said, it's a very well written summary of it's 5 or 10 pages that really help the uninitiated reader into some of the mysteries of what happened. One thing you leave out, which is my personal pet peeve, so I want to raise it with you, is the role of past bailouts, particularly of creditors, particularly of lenders to large financial institutions, in making leverage as easy as it became in the crisis. And I understand the emphasis on inadequate regulation and a free market ideology, but most of the free market ideologues in the history of the last 25 years, they were only free market ideologues when it was convenient. When it wasn't convenient, they were interventionists. When those bailouts came along, they always found a reason to help out the financial sector. What do you think about the importance of that in the crisis?
I agree with the analytical point that a pattern of bailouts over time will encourage risk-taking. But when I look at Bear Stearns before the crisis and ask myself, why did they have a leverage ratio of 33 to 1, I don't think it was primarily because they expected to be rescued if a bad thing happened. I think it was primarily because they were being squeezed by competition from a variety of new rivals following the elimination of the Glass-Steagall Act and a variety of other financial innovations. So they levered up their bets in this gamble to survive.
My claim is then, why did people lend them the money? And those are the people that I think are the people who contributed to the crisis. They were other competing, often, financial institutions that had seen what happened in the past when financial institutions went bust. Their creditors got 100 cents on the dollar. The equity holders got wiped out. So Bear didn't get rescued. So I don't think they were counting on the rescue. It's their creditors that were rescued, and they were made whole by the acquisition by J.P. Morgan Chase.
Yeah, so there is, as I said, I think moral hazard, which is what we're talking about,
correct,
is a factor there, and the world would be a safer place if there were alternatives to bailouts. So I think simply to assume that we can safely let tightly connected financial institutions fail is too easy. Lehman Brothers reminds us that it's too easy, but we've got to do a variety of things to make financial institutions more transparent and to deal with problems of interconnectedness that have made policymakers feel like bailouts are the only alternative. I agree it shouldn't be that way, and I agree that the world would be a safer financial place otherwise. I still don't entirely agree with you, Russ, about the Bear Stearns point. Bear had lots of different creditors, most of whose portfolios were only a fraction, small fraction, invested in this one problematic financial institution. So yeah, moral hazard may have been on the mind of Bank of America and J.P. Morgan and others. But again, I don't think it was myself that it was the major driver in the crisis.
Well, let's close with an open-ended question about the Fed. The Fed in the crisis, as we've been dancing around a little bit, Fed's done a number of unprecedented things. It's a very autonomous organization in a sense. Its independence is much talked about. Of course, it's also a very political organization. It is subject to political forces of various kinds, despite its so-called independence. Do you think there are any governance or institutional changes coming for the Fed, especially that are relevant to your discussion of the dollar as a dominant currency? Or do you think the Fed's going to continue to be as it is?
Well, I think the two things that will have to change are number one, residual secrets of the temple culture. The Fed will have to explain better how and why what it is doing are good for the average American. So Mr. Bernanke's press conference and his appearances on 60 Minutes, I think are necessary. The Fed will have to become more open and transparent in order to retain its legitimacy. Number two, I think the way the presidents of the regional reserve banks are appointed will change over time. For historical reasons, they tend to be appointed by committees of local businessmen and bankers. And it's not only, I think, the businessmen and bankers who will have to be represented in that decision.
It's pretty bizarro, isn't it, really, when you think about especially the New York branch, where it's not just, the banks that happen to be operating in New York. It's rather the most influential and largest financial institutions in the world are having a say, and then on the board of the representative who is their main conduit to Washington. It's a rather unhealthy political situation, seems to me.
Yeah, I think it is a bizarre legacy of the past. We want to be careful in terms of how we change it. You don't want the decision of who to appoint to become too political, too politicized. But I think the old ways there are on the way out.
My guest today has been Barry Eichengreen. Barry, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.